All right. Welcome, everyone.
Up there.
Yes, thank you for that reminder. Welcome, everyone, tonight, and those who join us later. We're glad you're with us. And since we've just been discussing it, those of you who still remember to join us tonight, those of you who do join us tonight, also remember to turn your clocks ahead tonight.
Tonight is March 11th.
Yes.
For everyone's keeping score. I only know that because it was our daughter's birthday yesterday, so I'm very much on top of what today's
What
date
today
is.
is, yes.
Tomorrow I'll start not knowing when the date is again.
Yes, we'll fall back into old habits. No, we spring ahead into old habits.
We spring ahead into
All right.
the briar patch. Okay.
Okay, let's talk to God, then we'll get launched. Thanks, Father, for this opportunity to be together again. Thank you for the way you watch over us as we're ready to launch into the close of Shabbat for another week, but I anticipate the Shabbat to come ahead of us. We would ask that the conversation would be good, positive, productive, and that we would learn stuff that we can better relate to our lives as we walk with you and as we communicate the relationship we have with you to others. For this we're grateful, because of Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen.
Who's that?
That's Matt. I was wondering who texted me, so anyhow. Yes, we've got, contrary to the last several sessions where we've had no questions that came in.
We were flooded with
We were
questions.
flooded with questions.
Letters. We get letters. We get stacks of letters. That's from Perry Como a long time ago.
I thought the one we'd start with tonight is the one that, in a sense, seems to build on something I shared as the service began last night.
Okay.
So
ripped from the Or Chadash headlines.
something along those lines.
Okay. This is the one I had to read through 3 times, and I'm still not sure that I got what the question was.
Well, either way, we will work our way through this as we think best,
Okay.
and we'll go from there. Now, I'm going to read the question, then I'm going to reflect again on what I shared last night, and then we'll go to try answering the question, and it's got several layers, I believe. It has been said that among those at Mount Sinai being given the Torah were the Israelites and those who joined with them, and then of all time. What distinguishes then the righteous Gentiles who are given the Noahide commands and to not follow idols, be physically moral, and not eat strangled animals? And then there's a notation here. In other words, not kosher slaughtered. Maybe another question. Correct. Anyhow, what distinguishes them? Hence, in Romans, when the Gentiles do not need to be circumcised, are they virtually at Mount Sinai, hence given the whole of the Torah, including tzitzit, seasons, and observances, or being out of the nations, being given the lesser set of God's instructions?
See, do you understand why I sort of couldn't follow the train of thought? Because there are about 15 trains of thought here.
Okay, and some really interesting and important, relevant ones. First, let me start with it has been said that among those at Mount Sinai being given the Torah were the Israelites and those who had joined with them of all time. In Jewish tradition, there is the understanding that God offered the Torah to the 70 nations of the world first, before offering them specifically to Israel, the Jewish people. First reflection on that is in rabbinic thinking, and therefore in the Jewish traditions, there has always been an idea that if you numbered all the nations of the world other than Israel, you'll come up with 70. So that's why this 70 nations keeps repeating. So there was the idea that God offered it to the 70 nations, the non-Israelite or non-Jewish nations, and they rejected it. So God offered it to Israel. Now, that's part one. Part two, as I understand that opening line, refers to Deuteronomy, or at least alludes to Deuteronomy 29, verses 10 to 15, when God renews the covenant. And when God renews the covenant with the second generation of those who left Egypt, the verses say that those who are gathered here this day are men, women, children, mentions officers or officials, it mentions tradesmen, it mentions, if I remember, something that you would consider more farming types, although obviously in the desert they weren't farming. And it mentions as well, and this will depend on the translation, either the alien or the foreigner who is among you. In other words, it mentions the non-Jewish groups who left Egypt along with the Jewish people and then walked through the wilderness with them for 40 years. So it was always what was called a mixed multitude, to use a literary phrasing, that included non-Jewish people who who had come to understand because of the plagues exactly what God intended the plagues to communicate, that He and He alone was the Lord of heaven and earth.
Yes, and that is overlooked 98% of the time when people talk about Mount Sinai and who's at the foot of Mount Sinai as Moses goes up to meet with God. There's Gentiles in that group. There's Gentiles that left Egypt and went along with the Jewish people. And there was not, you Gentiles all live over here and the Jews will live over here. It wasn't like that. They were all together. And so, remember, it's going to be, 6 weeks or a month after they leave Egypt, they're going to assemble at the foot of Mount Sinai, correct?
7 weeks.
7 weeks, that's right. So that would be Shavuot. At Shavuot, when they receive the law. It's going to be Jews and Gentiles. Now, the percentage of Gentiles out of that whole number of people, it's not going to be very high, but they were there. And from that point on, there's always been Gentiles in with the Jewish people. They don't have, at this point, they don't have a formal conversion ceremony because it's seen as families. So these families all left Egypt, families that were related through their common ancestor, Jacob. But that doesn't mean that the Gentiles who accompanied them were not adopted in. They certainly did not have an apartheid situation.
And I want you to get back to that and then stretch it through history in a minute. Mm-hmm. But I want to make the connection to last night. Mm-hmm. Now, in that text, not only were the Gentiles, but then the text says, and those who are not with you today. That's a reference to future generations, hence the term all time that was included in this question. So the covenant was renewed, not only with that second generation, renewed. The covenant that God gave at Mount Sinai through Moses, this is a renewal of that covenant. So there's been covenant renewals that have been part of our history, for all of our history, and that has other implications for other covenants. But this covenant is being renewed not only with you, but for those who are not here with you. In other words, for your children,
your descendants,
your children's children, and your descendants, and your descendants after the descendants, right on down. So that's I think what is being alluded to here. The connection to what I shared last night is just at the very beginning of the celebration of Purim in traditional Jewish circles, you will find the reading of Isaiah chapters 55 and 56. Isaiah chapter 56 concludes with some striking verses where it says, and I think it's verses 5 and 6 are right in there. It says, but to the foreigner who is among you, and again, translations vary as to how they translate this, alien, foreigner, stranger, whatever. To those who keep the Sabbath, who follow my covenant, who keep the Torah, they shall bring up their offerings and their sacrifices to the temple, and I will receive them, so that my house, talking about the temple, will be known as a house for all nations. So right from the outset, and Isaiah alludes to this, again, there were Gentiles who were part of the package, and in this particular case, leading into Purim, is this reminder from Isaiah 56 that God will accept the offerings and the sacrifices of those following his covenant, those observing Shabbat. Why is this connected with Purim? Because if you recall, and during our service the week before, we read the text from Esther 8 and 9. It says that many of those in the empire became Jews. They converted to Judaism. So this would be, the Isaiah passage would be an important passage as a reflection of those who join with the Jewish people to become connected with, if not officially part of Israel. Now, in all fairness, in Esther, they actually converted. Isaiah 56 is not necessarily talking to those who converted, but simply those who, like the Egyptians and perhaps whatever other foreigners, joined with the Egyptians in walking out of Egypt with Israel. It's referring to those who connected themselves somehow to the Jewish community, to the nation of Israel. And so the key term in this opening line is, this refers to those who joined with them. Not all Gentiles, but those who joined with them. Okay. That process continued throughout all of Jewish history, as Patrice mentioned. So would you bring in the whole question of God-fearers and then lead it into Acts 15? Yeah, because that's important to answering the question. Because it then asks, what are they supposed to follow? Noahide commandments, the Torah, and all those things. And then I'll say a couple things too.
Okay. Really? You're going to have me explain something I did a 20-page paper on? That's great.
Yeah, well, thank you for mentioning that. Very important background to answering this question and to related questions. It's not just an article, but it is in fact a chapter in the book, The Enduring Paradox. And if you have not read the book, you need to. If you've read the book and read the chapter, you need to reread it in this particular context. The chapter is called Modern Day God-Fearers.
Oh, yeah, that helped.
I know, but I just wanted to give that commercial so that people need to.
Okay. All right. There has always been, since Egypt, there has always been a way for Gentiles to become enveloped by the Jewish people, if the Gentile chooses. We don't know very early of formal conversion ceremonies or any. We don't know exactly what had to happen, but we do know that by the end of the wilderness travels, that any Gentiles that came with them from Egypt were now part of the Jewish people, formally part of the Jewish people. We can presume that some of that was through marriage. We can presume that some of that was, if it was a couple, a Gentile couple that came, that they would be adopted by one of the tribes as part of that tribe. That kind of thing continued on through the centuries. We think about Ruth. Ruth was a convert to Judaism. Once again, Christians don't ever talk about that. It makes them uneasy, it makes them nervous, because it doesn't say words to that effect in Ruth. But the assumption is there, because Boaz would not have accepted Ruth as a wife if he wasn't convinced that she was Jewish. Is that fair enough to say? I don't know if I've ever put it that flatly before.
Yeah. I think that's the ultimate meaning of your people will be
my people and my people. So she committed to being Jewish to her mother-in-law. So the nice verse that so many people use in their wedding ceremony, whither thou goest, I shall go, and where thou lodgest, I shall lodge, and not in King James anymore, but that was said by one woman to another woman, to her mother-in-law, not from one married couple to one partner to the other. Although it's very nice and could be said by them, but it's not in the scriptures like that. And that, what that signifies then is, she's saying, I am not from Moab anymore. I am not a Moabitess, as they said in the King James. I am now a Jew, and I will follow you and worship your God and do what you would like me to do, because I'm adopting myself into your family. As I said, usually churches do not want to talk anything about that. They just want to talk about the romance and how great Boaz is. And he's pretty great. He is pretty great. And where was I going to go from here? Okay, after that, we know for sure from Ruth on, there's been a way for everybody to identify other than a person. You know, you can self-identify. We do that all the time. You know, are you, I'm trying to think, are you a veteran? I'm a veteran. Well, you might be lying. Yeah, but usually we take somebody's word when they say they're a veteran, for example. I could think of other examples. But if you are so ensconced with the Jewish people, even though your DNA does not say that you're descended from Jacob, does everybody see that's a DNA problem? Does everybody see that even though you don't have DNA relatives that are Jewish necessarily, you can still say, I am Jewish? In different generations, that would have been less formal or more formal, and it continued on. You know that in certain time periods, Jews are under persecution because they're forbidden to make converts. So that's the big tip-off. Are the Jews being persecuted? Well, are they permitted to convert people? No? Yeah, they're being persecuted then, kind of thing. Where was I going with this? See, it's too much of a scope of the whole God-fearsome.
Oh, how they lived.
Okay, all right.
And
so
then
here's I think I get what he wants me to tell you. So how did this work out? And we're coming into, I would say, intertestamental times is when this finally started to lay down its tracks.
Certainly Second Temple period.
Second Temple period also, where you have Gentiles who are interested in Judaism. They're just average Gentiles on the street. They're interested. They see how the Jewish people live, and many cultures in the Second Temple period, non-Jewish cultures, looked at the Jewish culture and said, you know, these people really are having a great life, and they seem satisfied, and we know they're moral, and we know they're helpful, and we know they're all around good people. I wonder if this kind of thing is something I could become involved in. So that's the mental thought process. And sure enough, during the Second Temple period, there was a method by which Gentiles could formally become members of the Jewish people. And here's what they were first instructed to do. Or they would just show up at a synagogue on Shabbat. Remember, a Saturday in the Roman Empire, not a Sabbath at that point. So they would have to take off work. Many women were told, and we're told this in information very close to the scriptures, historical information, there were a lot of women around the Roman Empire who were very attracted by Judaism. And especially if they were wealthier or their husband had a lot of power, they didn't have to work. They had servants who would do their household chores. And so they were free to examine and meet with people and have a very nice social life. But many of these people interested in Judaism, and there were some, they would start going to Shabbat services at the local synagogue. And once they started to listen to Shabbat services, they would get to know some of the people in the synagogue, and if they wanted to learn more, they could probably have an appointment with a rabbi. They could probably have discussion groups there at the synagogue, depending on how large it was. And at some point, the person would make a choice about whether they wanted to continue and go on to actually being Jewish, or whether they just wanted to leave it at that, and then just, it was sort of, for the synagogue, this would be a PR purpose. In other words, people in the community are coming to see what we're doing, and they appreciate what we're doing, even if they don't join up with us. But there were some who joined up and signed their name on the line. Now, if you were a man, that would mean you would have to be circumcised. So that's the final step for a man, would be to get circumcised, which was not a popular, it's the most unpopular thing a man could do. According to Christian authors, it was very shameful, very shameful. Not to be something that would be sought after or prestigious. It was the opposite. In fact, becoming Jewish at all was, other parts of the Roman Empire laughed at Jews, and there's different Roman plays where they make fun of Jews, like, what about, it's like, I think we would say the equivalent of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a polite word, hillbillies. They'd be like the equivalent of hillbillies in that, who'd want to do that? It's so old-fashioned, and aren't they all poor, and that kind of relationship. But the man would have to get circumcised. Women obviously did not get circumcised. That was not their final entrance into the Jewish community. But each gender would have to go through a mikveh, which is a ceremonial washing and as part of their commitment to Judaism. In public, well, not in public, but you know what I mean. It wasn't like, I'm going to take myself down and dunk myself. No, I have to be witnessed, and there has to be words given. And also, ironically, that another mark that you were becoming Jewish is you would you would pay the temple tax. So that was your financial obligation, and you continue to pay the temple tax down through your life. And as I said, it did happen, even though it was made fun of. It would not be a status symbol. It would be the opposite of a status symbol. It would not mean you're one of the high and mighty. It would mean you're going further and further into hillbillydom. And yet, it continued to happen. And there were times in history when the Jewish people actually put a lot of effort into converting Gentiles. We don't see that nowadays, but there were time periods where you saw in Esther, because of what happened in Esther, you would think that Gentiles would run away as fast as they could. On the contrary, it drew some non-Jewish people to become Jews. And so it sort of is counterintuitive as to maybe the way we've been taught, or the situation has been ignored. So when we get to Acts 15, Acts 15 is all about what on earth do we do with these Gentiles who want to worship Yeshua. What are we going to do? Because they're coming and coming and coming, and they're not going away. Do they have to become Jews in order to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob through the life and death of Yeshua? So are they going to all have to convert? And there is a discussion about it. There's a bunch of verses there. And the decision is finally made in Acts 15, where Yaakov, Yeshua's brother, he's the head of, I know people want to say Peter was in charge of anything, but I think that is one area where the Catholic Church has not helped historians, because the Catholic Church has always pushed Peter as in charge of everything from the beginning, except he wasn't. And in Acts 15, Yaakov is in charge of the meeting, and certain things were laid down as to how we can be sure that Gentiles who want to worship Yeshua the Messiah, they don't have to become Jews, but, and then there's 4 different things. I don't have them in front of me, so I can't remember exactly. I will lose 2 out of the 4. But there's these 4. And just when I tell you that Christian churches today do not preach on this thing that's all about Gentile participation in the faith of the Jewish people, which is what it is. Yeah. If I tell you they don't even deal with this, oh yeah, the 4, you got the 4?
Mhm.
I can read them, I can read them 4.
Yeah. Starting at verse 20.
Okay. So, Yaakov has this decision about what Gentiles have to do, that Gentiles never hear. You're never going to hear this unless you read it in the Bible for yourself. It is my judgment, this is Yaakov, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write to them. Once again, they're not present in the room. They're out there. They're out there in the Roman Empire. Telling them, number 1, don't eat food polluted by idols. Number 2, don't engage in sexual immorality. Number 3, don't eat the meat of strangled animals. And number 4, don't eat blood. Well, that's it. So if you've checked off those 4 things, I guess you're in good standing with the early church. So the only one we have to follow is sexual immorality. Well, then it's really easy for us. We can get rid of those other 3. We're good. We're all good. Because, sexual immorality. No, it says those other 3 too, which is never actually looked into or discussed, which I find ludicrous. And then the next verse says, the reasoning behind it is Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times and is read in the synagogues on every Sabbath. Well, what does that mean as far as a Gentile goes? He's saying that if a Gentile wants to understand these things and wants to follow these things, they need to start going to synagogues, because the synagogues are going to explain all of these things to them. And we never hear that part. It's never talked about. It's like presto changeo. All we have to care about is sexual immorality. If I'm not having hinky sex, then I guess I'm a good follower of Yeshua. Except that's not what it says. And what's that thing about not eating blood? Literally, John and I were in Germany. I think we may have told this group, but we're going to repeat it because it was a mind-blowing incident for us. We're in Germany and we're prepping this group of German Christians, really great people, really nice, very down to earth, because we're going to lead them. We're going to organize a trip to Israel. The tour guy is going to lead them, but we know we're there. I don't know. We're their rah-rah people. Let's go, Germans. We're going to enjoy Israel. And we happened to get onto this topic, but it was through Genesis, I believe.
I don't remember.
Noah's covenant.
Yeah, I don't remember how we got on.
Noah's covenant. And something came up about don't eat blood. And this very serious, tall guy stood up and goes, what is this about not eating blood? And we went, well, yeah, it's here in Genesis, and it's here in Acts 15. He was upset. Why has no one told us this? And John and I are sitting there going, we don't know. We're sorry. We weren't around. We couldn't. But it's been here in the scriptures, for thousands of years. Because we eat blood sausage, and we both went, yeah, we understand that's true. I don't know what finally happened, but it was an awakening for them.
It was an awakening.
There was something there that they were mad that they hadn't been told. And instead of sticking to, we've always done it this way and we love blood sausage and how dare you, they went well, if God said to do something, then we want to do it. Or if God said not to do something, we don't want to do it. What a concept. Because usually we don't hear that kind of sentiment. At least in 21st century America. So, abstain from food polluted by idols. We don't have that problem so much anymore because we don't have a lot of food that's sacrificed to foreign idols. So that would be off the table for us. However, if you ever moved to a country where they did worship other different gods, you'd want to avoid that. Sexual immorality, yeah, let's not be doing that. I wanted to point out in this time period too, if you recall, or even if you didn't recall, let me alert you, that the Greek gods, and especially the Roman gods, there were certain gods in their pantheons that the way you worship them was through sexual acts. And the way, and this is true about Baal too, there were subsets of worshiping Baal and the Greek gods and the Roman gods where what you did, you would go on purpose to a meeting house or a temple, and you would do all sorts of kinky sex things, including with animals, with strangers. And that was part of your worship that you would do with them. We're all adults here. Any children are not on the line. But that's the way they worshiped. So this had to be said, that this is, you can't do that and be one of God's people. Sorry, that's off the table. And in those cultures, especially in the Roman culture, for a man to go to one of these places where they would actually employ prostitutes of either gender and have sex with somebody he doesn't know, that wouldn't be that big of a deal. That happened pretty regularly. It was ho-hum. But part of this is saying, yeah, you can't do that. That is not cool. That is a big no from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And once again, people don't realize that either, because it's unseemly to talk about it, in houses of worship or during worship services. But that would be a normal part of living in that culture. And it would not be seen as sin. It would be seen, they stopped off at the bar and had a few drinks on the way home, about that degree of seriousness. So, each of these four things uncovers something deep within the culture that they are currently living in that would prevent you from being a good Jewish person. The meat of strangled animals and blood, and that's two types of things that are totally unkosher as far as the food you eat. And I don't know about you, but we say this at our house, we say it every Passover, and Americans today, don't tell them they can't eat something, because they just swarm for it. They just, there's like a 2-year-old, how dare you tell me I can't eat, fill in the blank. I'm going to eat even more of it now that I know that, because it's ridiculous. How dare you? And I've seen enough Americans do that. Even when you tell them at a Passover meal, you can't eat anything after dessert, they get really huffy. That really, I don't know, them's fighting words. If you ever wanted to start a war with any Americans, just tell them they can't have dessert. They just get furious. Am I wrong on that?
No.
You're laughing at me. Yeah, I'm laughing too. But, so even these four things here in the middle of Acts 15 are totally misunderstood. And I think whether it was a deliberate misunderstanding or a true misunderstanding, in other words, they read it and they don't understand it, but they don't care, then you have a swarm of Gentiles entering into congregations, either going to synagogues or maybe not going to synagogues, just starting their own meetings, and they don't have a clue about the Older Testament at all. They have less than a clue, but they're going to figure it out themselves, and God must accept them, because it said so, that they didn't have to work hard to become believers if you weren't born Jewish. Was that sort of what you wanted me to say?
Yes, that's essential background for understanding not only Acts 15, Genesis 9, those who came out of Egypt along with the Jewish people, and the framework for this particular question. Now, it has to do with the role of Gentiles in the plan of God. As Patrice has provided us the background for And there's a nice little chart, by the way, of this in the chapter on modern-day God-fearers.
Yes.
There were, in relating to the nation of Israel and to the Jewish people, historically there have been 4 different possibilities. And that's inherent within the question that is raised as well as in Acts 15. There are those who were simply Gentiles. There were those who were Gentiles who then wanted to in some way associate with the nation of Israel. And there were 3 ways they could connect with the nation of Israel. So there were Gentiles who didn't want to associate with the nation of Israel. Class 1. Class 2 is Gentiles who wanted sort of a tangential connection with the nation of Israel. I had the word and it's popped right out of my mind. As loose a connection as possible. For them, the bottom line was to follow the Noahide commandments, as the text says, or the question asks here, the Noahide commands, which are reflected in Acts chapter 15. There were those who wanted to draw closer to the nation of Israel, and what they did is this is now the 3rd group of Gentiles. They adopted more and more of a Jewish lifestyle, and eventually adopted all of a Jewish lifestyle without formally converting. These became known in the Second Temple period as God-fearers. And then the 4th type of Gentile was the one who went all the way and converted.
Correct. So I apologize. I forgot to give them the label. The Gentiles who were very involved with synagogue life, very much regular attenders at the synagogue and holidays, Jewish holidays, but didn't convert formally. In other words, the men didn't have a circumcision. They were called God-fearers. Unfortunately, and this is, I wouldn't say it's a pet peeve of mine, but it's a very, very bad misunderstanding. Many Christians have been taught, and many Messianic Jews have been taught, that Jews and Gentiles during Yeshua's lifetime did not eat together.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have anything to do with each other. They didn't get along. And the example is always pointed out when this is brought up. That Shimon and Rav Shaul have a discussion, a fight, about this, about who is not eating with the people at the common tables. Am I correct? And who is the one that's eating with the Gentiles at the common tables? Or doesn't think it's that bad to do that?
Rav Shaul.
Rav Shaul. And it's Shimon who is being super, I'm not eating with those Gentiles because they're unclean. And that's always emphasized that, Gentiles couldn't catch a break. Those Jews, they were mean and partisan and very strict, and so who would want to be like them? But there's every indication that Jews and Gentiles ate together. It was just what the Jews ate when they sat there. What is it that they're eating as they're sitting there? And is the Gentile forcing them to eat something that has blood in it? I don't think it's going to be like that. I think it's going to be something like it's a kosher meal, and so the Gentiles can join in without making the food unkosher. Yes, that could happen. Please tell your friends. I think people are taught the wrong historical viewpoint because they're pushing how Gentiles have every right to do what we're doing and have our own church and do this. Because we have to get rid of the Jewish people being in charge because the Gentiles should be in charge. They're much more open-minded. And I think that is, maybe you don't say those exact words, but that's what you come away with from those discussions. I wanted to mention that if you wanted to see the actual covenant with Noah, which applies to all people. Remember, Noah and his family came off the ark, and then God gave this covenant for all people. There are no Jews at this point. And you can find that in Genesis 6. Nope,
9.
9, sorry.
Close, turn the number upside down.
Because my page flipped while I was talking. God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, number 4. Oh, it says, everything that lives and moves will be food for you, just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. Here's a very important definition that we all need to memorize. Food is different depending on what culture you're raised in. What you think of automatically when I say the word food, and what you say, no, that's not food, if I happen to mention it, is all due to your culture and what you were raised with. There are many cultures in the world for whom snake is food. There are many cultures in the world for whom dogs are food. They'd be fine. That'd be fine if you had some dog. Many cultures in the world think cats are food. It'd be fine with them if you had some cat casserole. That's not what our culture thinks of as food. Here's another broad category. Most Americans will not say that locusts are food. Even if they were dying, a lot of them would not eat locusts to stay alive. And yet, they're listed as food for John the Baptist. And they're kosher food, they're fine. Don't have to be sacrificed. It's very good for him. I'm not having locusts. Food is a very culturally tied phenomenon. And we learn our prejudices about, yes, I'm willing to eat that, or no, I would never eat that on a bet. Even if I was dying, I would not eat that. So you say now when you're not actually dying. But I'm just saying, there's a very strong detestation of things that I could name that other cultures think are perfectly fine as food. We're not even going to talk about whether or not it's sinful. If you're dying and you refuse to eat any food that's not kosher, that's not really helpful. That God doesn't hold you to keep kosher if you're actually dying of no food. Once again, that's not something many people know about at all. It's not seen as a sin if you're actually starving. But back to our topic. So when the word food gets brought up, like in this passage in Genesis, anything and everything that lives and moves will be food for you. So that means that I can have cobra bites, which I was on a menu that we, at a restaurant we were over in Tampa. I can't make this up. They also had gator, but I've seen that before. But cobra bits, so that's fine because that's what Genesis says. Or is it using a different attitude about food? Because the topic there is, it's the meats. It's like Arby's. It's the meats. So any plant that doesn't kill you is good for food. If it's going to kill you, don't eat it. You know, it doesn't point blank say that in the scripture. By the way, poisonous plants, not kosher. Okay. But it says, once again, you have to keep in mind their definition of food is different than Americans' definition of food is different from Senegalese definition of food is different from Thai definition of food. And so you need to see it in that context. Everything that lives and moves will be food for you, just as I gave you the green plants. And there's some, it's understood that this is the time period before this. It seems as though people were pretty much vegetarian. And there is no problem with blood and vegetarianism. In fact, if you ever want to make sure that you're eating basically kosher food, like on an airline or in another country, ask for vegan, ask for a vegetarian meal. Oh, here you go. Then you'd have to worry if it has followed kosher laws or not, because there's no interaction of blood with it. But in verse 4, chapter 9, verse 4, you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. Or, as one of my professors once said, do not eat meat off of a living animal. What? Is that a hypothetical? Like, we haven't seen anybody do that actually, but don't even try. No, it was because it actually happened. They would take an animal, they would cut off one leg and eat the leg and leave the animal with 3. It's the first thing here. Don't do that. That's cruel. It's cruel. Don't do it. Even if it's a kosher animal. Stop it right now. The food was not grown for you. The food is an animal that God is watching. And God counts their blood in the same way that he counts your blood. He counts all blood that is shed. It's in his accounting books. If you killed somebody or some animal, God made an account for it and continues to make an account for the deaths and the blood that's been spilled by human beings. I don't think he's going to judge a lion as harshly as he does human beings. Correct? All right. And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. In other words, if you die, God sees that and he marks it in his book. Somebody killed them. I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal. So he even marks off the human beings that have killed, but he marks off animals that have killed too. This is not anything you ever hear when you hear the story of Noah, but this is part of the covenant that everyone in the world has with God. Whoever sheds the blood of people, by people shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made human beings. As for you guys, Noah, be fruitful, increase in number, and multiply on the earth, and increase upon it. So, the definition of food always comes into play. When you see the word food, always remember, what is their definition of food? Is their food something that I would eat? Is their food something I should, that it's good to eat for you? It doesn't matter if the food that you've eaten is delicious or not. So I know many people like bacon. I know that. It's they joke about it. It's ever so funny and popular. Except it doesn't matter if it tastes good or not. I'm sure there are many different things that taste good in the world, but really don't eat them. And once again, this is another topic that Americans in the 21st century, they don't want to hear this. It really makes them peeved. Am I off the topic now?
Yeah.
Oh. But anyway, so God-fearers were this group of people that were not formal converts to Judaism, but they were ever so close. And they lived in their lifestyle as what was called God-fearers. The most important, earliest example of a faithful God-fearer who is honored for his service to God is a man by the name of Cornelius. Cornelius is in the book of Acts, and we don't have time to go into his story. Suffice it to say, he's a Roman soldier. He lives in Caesarea. Caesarea is Gentile center. Caesarea is where the Roman army and its commanders and the government of Judea was in Caesarea. Caesarea was where Pontius Pilate lived. Pontius Pilate did not live in Jerusalem. He went and visited Jerusalem when it was important, like before the holidays where everyone would come from around the country to go to Jerusalem to celebrate that holiday. He lived with his wife in Caesarea on the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, so everything that you've been taught about that from really bad historical passion plays and movies about the trial and of Yeshua, they're meeting at at his judgment seat. They're not meeting at Pilate's house. Pilate's wife is not there. That's his job space. That's the Roman Empire's building where they conduct trials and where they have judgments being given down from the Roman emperor and empire. It's not where he was. Pontius Pilate does not live there. He can't wait to get back to Caesarea because that's where all the Romans hang out, and that's where he can be Roman. However, there is a gentleman there. He's in charge of, I can't remember how many people. It's over 100 people. His name is Cornelius, and it says in the text, he was a God-fearer. So this Roman soldier who lives in Caesarea was a God-fearer. What? He's a Roman soldier. He's a Gentile who worships the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What? Well, where is he going to go to synagogue? Well, believe it or not, just south of Caesarea, on the border of the city, guess what? There was a Jewish town there. And the Jewish people did not go into the city, but they stayed in the Jewish town that's right there on the border. So Cornelius could have gone to synagogue services regularly, or holiday services regularly. Not only him, but it says his whole household. So there's a whole household of Romans that are God-fearers. And does God say, oh, that's wrong, he's a Gentile, he can't possibly fit in, and plus he's a Roman, get out of here, poo-poo. No. It says that while Cornelius was praying in the afternoon, by the way, when he's praying in the afternoon, it said, this is the time when, if you were in Jerusalem, you'd be praying the afternoon prayers.
Well, and offering a sacrifice.
And offering a sacrifice. And I don't think he's offering a sacrifice, though. He's
No,
praying.
but at the time of the offering.
At the time of the offering in the afternoon. And he's praying. And an angel speaks to him and says, your prayers and your offerings have been accepted by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who calls him righteous. And within a day or two, a knock comes at Cornelius' door. And who is it? Who came to Gentile Central to visit Cornelius? It's Shimon. It's Simon Peter. And what is Simon Peter there to say to Cornelius? You have been accepted by the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and I've been sent here to teach you about Judaism. Let's get started. It's such a different story than we might imagine. And then we leave Cornelius. We never find out how his family relate. We never find out if he becomes a convert formally, but he, in and of himself, and his family, who support him. And evidently he has soldiers that support him, it says in that passage too. Once again, this is a story that we never tell in public or in churches, because why would we care about that? Is that enough? Did I talk enough?
Yeah.
Because I'm sort of tired of talking.
Oh, okay. To wrap this up, I want to ask you to reflect with me past, present, and future, because within this question, there really are elements that are past, present, and future. Patrice has sketched for you what the past looked like as to how Gentiles who wanted to connect with the Jewish community in some fashion or other, how they did so. How does that relate to us in the present? That's the implications of Acts chapter 15. And then there's a future element here too that I want to reflect on in answering this question. If you're reading Acts 15 correctly now against the background that's been given, it's in answer to the question, what do I as a Gentile have to do in order to follow Yeshua now that I've come into a relationship with him by acknowledging him as the Messiah of Israel and the Lord of the universe. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to live? How am I supposed to behave? And in answer to that question, you have Acts 15, verses 20 and 21. Acts 15, verse 20 lists 4 of the things, as Patrice pointed out, that God instructed Noah and his descendants to do. Now, she implied this, but she didn't ask you the direct question. If you're not Jewish, are you a descendant of Noah? And the answer is yes. If you're Jewish, are you a descendant of Noah? Yes. We're all descendants of Noah. All right. So the instructions that God gave to Noah were intended to apply to all people, regardless of their connection to the Jewish people. Okay? That's what was intended. And if you were going to live in Israel in ancient days, the minimum that would be required of you is, of course, following the instructions of Noah. As Patrice pointed out, some people became more and more attached to what both the people, the community that they were living in, as well as to their way of relating to God. These are the ones that eventually moved into the status of God-fearing, the more and more that they became associated with this community. That's where Cornelius comes in. He had become that attached. If you were a God-fearer, you lived and practiced as a Jew, but had not yet converted. Everything else you did, but not yet converted.
Let me just insert in that, and that it would be very likely that the children of the people who are God-fearers would convert to Judaism. That was a normal thing
That was a
to have happen.
common practice, yeah.
Even if the parents didn't convert formally, the kids would.
Okay, so against that background, in comes Acts 15 in answer to the question, what should a Gentile do? And the answer comes back in Acts 15, verse 20, where they discussed it earlier in Acts 15, summarized it in Acts 15:20. These are the 4 things you're supposed to do. And there's some question as to some of the implications of 1 or 2 of those things. But as it turns out, a generation earlier, there was a rabbi by the name of Hillel. And he was asked a question. So, if a Gentile wants to relate to the God of Israel, what is he or she to do? And Hillel's answer is exactly what you find in Acts 15, verse 20. In effect, James, Yaakov, and the others of the leaders in Jerusalem who were the leaders of the movement following Yeshua, they in effect were quoting Hillel here in answer to that question. No big surprise for anyone of a number of reasons, and this relates to a question that we may not get to tonight, but I'll go on a quick offshoot here. And this is really problematic for us, and we've addressed this on a couple occasions tangentially. We'll address it again in answer to the question. Too often, the way things are taught today, both in some circles of Christianity and even in many circles of Messianic Judaism, is that Yeshua was anti-Pharisaic. He was against the Pharisees. And yet, in Acts 15, Yeshua's very brother is quoting the chief rabbi of the Pharisees from a generation before. Are you getting the point? They were anything, Yeshua and his followers, his disciples, were anything but anti-Pharisaic. And this is just one example. We'll have to get to that other question, may not get to it tonight, but I want to, since it butts its head into this discussion here, I wanted to mention that. As they understood the instructions that God gave to Noah and through Noah to those around him, to Noah and those who followed him, who were his descendants, they were able to separate out 7 different guidelines, 4 of which are mentioned here and were mentioned by Hillel and therefore mentioned by Yaakov. Another quick aside, because this is important. Why only 4 of the 7? The answer is because the other 3 were already laws of the Roman Empire. And if you didn't do those, you wouldn't be alive to try to fulfill these 4. Fair enough?
Okay, good reason.
Good reason. And that's why Hillel only mentioned 4. He didn't need to mention the other 3. I was going to make a joke about dead people, but I'll leave that alone. So, that's the bottom line. You've got to follow the Noahide covenant. Another quick aside that occurred to me as you were talking, and I checked this out. Please remember, and regarding food and animals you can eat, what were the instructions to Noah? 2 of every kind of animal that are unclean animals, but 7 of every kind of clean animal. Now, this just, as often as I've taught on this and read this, this never occurred to me. But as you were talking, this is what occurred to me. If you're coming off the ark, after however many days it was on, and you were told you could eat animals, which animals would you not likely eat? Well, the unclean ones, for 2 reasons, because it was only the clean ones that were now able to be offered in sacrifice to God. There was already a distinction in place. But if you ate of the pairs of unclean animals, there wouldn't be any more of those animals to exist thereafter.
That's what happened with unicorns.
Yes, that's what happened. Yes,
That's why we don't have them anymore.
that's right.
Oh, good, they're laughing, that's good.
So you, in all likelihood, even without the instruction, you would have been drawn to eat the animals that were more plentiful, which were what? The clean animals. Okay, that was my aside that occurred to me as you were talking.
Awesome.
I thought that was sort of cool. That and the unicorns.
Yeah. Very important.
Back to Acts 15. So there's your bottom line. As a Gentile, that's what you needed to do. This is not new information. What? Because, as Patrice pointed out, all the way back to the time when people from outside Israel joined Israel. Now, verse 21 continues with a very interesting conjunction, and this is for you, Jessica. It's the conjunction gar in Greek. Okay?
For.
Conjunction gar is not a but, it is a for, and it functions as a continuative.
Yes,
A reason I point.
continues on, it doesn't stop anything.
I mentioned that to Jessica because she's taking Greek through the
Gar's
seminary.
easy to remember.
Through the seminary in yeshiva. So, what you have here is verse 21 builds on verse 20. In effect, what Yaakov or James is saying is, here's a bottom line. If you want more, here's where you get the more. Where do you get the more? Moses is taught in the synagogue. You get the more by going to the synagogue, getting more information, and if God leads you beyond that, beyond the bottom 4, in this case the bottom line 7, then that's great, but that's the way in which you get more. So, that's the past as it relates now to the present. For the present, if we are going to be consistent with Acts 15, every person alive who's a follower of Yeshua needs to follow at least the Noahide commandment or covenant. But that was the intent of it all the way back in Genesis chapter 9 anyhow. Okay? And then there's that 4. If you want to learn more and do more, here are the options and opportunities. Show up in synagogue. So, for all of you who are joining us either in person or will join us later, we want to see you next Friday night in the synagogue.
Well, it doesn't have to be hours.
Well, that's my commercial. Don't ruin my commercial. So that's the present. I promise the future because this is important in, I think, if I've understood the question correctly in relating to this question. So what is the role of Gentiles through time? We've done the past, we've dealt with the present, but it appears that there is something more that's going to take place in the future. And that something more is something that is part of Jewish liturgy in every Shabbat service, and certainly we do it as well. We know it as Vayhi ben Soah. It's looking forward to the time when what? The law will go forth from Jerusalem and the word of the Lord from Mount Zion, or maybe I flipped those, whichever way. But those verses are preceded by this. Those from among the nations will say to themselves, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, Jerusalem, and worship the God of Jacob. If you're going to go up to the mountain of the Lord in Jerusalem and worship the God of Jacob, in what way are you going to do that? Especially if the word is now coming forth from Jerusalem, in effect from the temple. You're going to be involved in more and more Jewish stuff. That's what the future looks like. And then it goes on, that's the same text that goes on, very similar to Isaiah 11, which talks about, and they will learn war no more, and that whole kind of, there'll be peace on the earth, and that, all of that kind of stuff.
Swords into potions.
That's where it's like, swords into farming implements, or whatever plowshare is. It's not a share of a plow.
No, it's a farming.
It's a farm implement. Okay, so, by the way, you have a similar text in either Zechariah 8 or 9, I think it's Zechariah 8, somewhere around verse 13, where it says again, 10 from among the nations will take hold of the clothes of one who is a Jew and say, take me with you, I want to worship your God. Or if you're going to grab hold of a Jew and say, take me with you, I want to worship your God, what kind of worship is that going to be? Now, Isaiah 2, Zechariah 8 are looking towards the future. So apparently in the future, that's what it's going to look like. More and more of those, if not all of those, who follow Yeshua in that future time will do so in a Jewish fashion. In other words, it appears that in the future they will all be God-fearers. And if they are all God-fearers in the future, then they will have connected themselves to the Torah. And as this begins, those who have joined with them of all time. So certainly into the future time, this appears to be what the situation will be. This is not, this should not be surprising. Going back to when King Solomon dedicated the temple, as he prayed to God and as he dedicated the temple, he asked that this would ultimately be your house will be a house for all.
A house of prayer for all nations.
A house of prayer for all nations. So from the onset from the very beginning of the temple, right on through the prophetic texts, implied in Acts 15, I'm suggesting, is this time in the future when it will be truly that again. Now, to some degree, first and second temple function that way for those from among the nations who wanted to join. But this appears to be a time in the future when great crowds, if not the whole world, will be moving in this direction. And let me see if I've picked up most of what is said here. So that'll be the connection to the Torah for the people of the future. That's how it used to be with certain groups of people in the past, groups being non-Jewish groups. But it's a history that goes back not only to the Second Temple period, but all the way to the time of the Exodus, which we will get to celebrate in just a couple weeks. But anyhow, I wanted to finish where I began, and that is Isaiah 56. This is what it wasn't just read now that I think of it. It's actually chanted as part of the Purim service in traditional synagogues. And the foreigners, non-Jews, who bind themselves to the Lord to serve him, to love the name of the Lord, and to worship him, all who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it, and who hold fast to my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain, and give them joy in my house of prayer. Their offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. And then the reading concludes. The sovereign Lord declares, he who gathers the exiles of Israel, I will gather not only them, still others to them, besides those that are already gathered. So that seems to be the prognosis for the future, the outlook for the future. And hopefully this has provided some of the background and framework for this question and answered most of the question, at least as far as I can understand it. If I know that this question was asked by one of two people, if we didn't answer it sufficiently for you, slap me upside the head next Friday and we'll talk about it.
No, don't do that. I want to urge everybody. Acts 10 is the story of Cornelius, who he was, what he was doing, what the angel that was sent to him said to him about what he was doing, and how Shimon Peter comes, understanding that God has said that Cornelius is righteous. The angel calls Cornelius righteous, and he's as Gentile as you would like to be, and lives in the middle of Gentile city. He and his family and some of his officers even are all on this same God-fearer track, and it is positively almost makes you want to weep because of the praiseworthiness of how Cornelius has been living his life. He's a way better Jew than I ever am, so I'm just saying. And one ironic thing, which is, it's ironic funny. So the verse that comes right before Acts 10:1 is, something became known all over Jaffa. That Joppa, as it might be in your Bible, is the Greek term for Jaffa, today's city that's in near Tel Aviv. And many people believed in the Lord. Shimon Peter stayed in Jaffa for some time with a tanner named Simon. A tanner. What did a tanner do? A tanner made the dead bodies of animals into leather. So tanners went into, or the family went into an occupation that required them to be unbelievably unclean and touching dead bodies as part of their work and draining blood as part of their work. And so they almost were never clean. So they must have had certain schedules which would make it possible for them, if they wanted to go to synagogue for Shabbat or if they wanted to celebrate a Jewish holiday, they were going to have to think ahead because they touched dead bodies and blood all day long. And who did Simon Peter get sent to stay with? A family that dealt with dead bodies and blood as part of their career, as part of their service to the Jewish people, because leather is acceptable to have and to touch in a Jewish framework. Dead bodies and carcasses and blood, totally unacceptable for people to touch and to have within their home. What makes the difference between leather and a dead body? Why, it's the work of the tanner. And his work, their work, I should say, it would be the whole family would be involved in this, would require them to be unclean so much of their lives. But they're doing it as a service, as a necessary service. Even today we would see leather making as a necessary service for human life. Now that we have plastic, maybe not as important as it used to be, but up until 100 years ago, extremely important for everyone to flourish. I just think it's funny that Peter, the one who didn't want to sit with Gentiles when he was eating and caused a kerfuffle with his fellow apostle, God, I guess, said, yeah, here's where you're going to stay. They're unclean all the time. So let's deal with that, shall we? I guess you're going to have to learn how to live with that, Peter. I just think it's an ironic thing. And it's mentioned again about when Cornelius, later on, he's telling his story. He said, send to Joppa to Jaffa for Simon, who's called Peter. He is a guest in the home of Shimon the tanner, who lives by the sea. Of course you'd live by the sea if you were a tanner. You'd have to wash everything all the time. You'd just be, give me more stuff to wash with. We just got to clean this whole place up, especially if we're going to have Passover here next week. Lots of cleanup to do.
Okay, a couple reflections in a couple directions. One on this same subject. Again, I'm going to give you a homework assignment.
They're reading Acts 10 as their homework assignment.
Oh, I'm going to go back to the homework assignment I implied earlier.
Okay.
Read or reread Modern Day God-Fearers in the Enduring Paradox. If you don't have it, we've got them right over here if you show up on the premises, or you can order them through us by way of the website. Because that's important to this whole issue, not only of what the question raised, but also of the role of Gentiles.
Make sure it has the chart included. There's a chart. I love to put charts
Yeah.
in papers that I write, especially if we have trouble visualizing it. So there's a chart in there. If you don't have the chart for the God-fearers paper, you need to see the chart.
Okay, that is in the chapter itself.
It's in the book, but
In the
in
book.
case you have it some other way.
Yes, exactly. All right, so that's one. Part two of your homework, because in this discussion, we've touched on both the other questions that were submitted to us. One had to do with, as I said, anti-Pharisaic stances or attitudes. And it is so prevalent, in fact, I will say this, that one of the major Messianic organizations, whom I will leave unnamed, even put together a paper, or if not a booklet or book, that took a very strong anti-Pharisaic, anti-rabbinic stance, and the two are connected, but we'll talk about that when we answer the question.
Yeah, that's not good.
Yes, it's not good at all. So, in answer to, I at least suggested the beginnings of an answer to that, but if you want to read more on that, speaking of books, also on that table, or available through us, is a book called Opening Rabbinic Doors to the Gospels by our good friend Tom Tribblehorn. That's very important in reading in this particular area. There is also, if you want to do heavier duty reading, something called a Rabbinic Commentary on the Gospels, written by a Jewish rabbi. His name is Samuel Lachs, Lachs. And it also occurred to me that our former office manager wrote her master's thesis for the seminary and yeshiva on the striking parallels between, the consistent parallels between the Sermon on the Mount and the rabbinic teachings, rabbinic literature or sources. So that's stuff that you would have to get a copy of. You'd have to request a copy of that through the seminary and yeshiva. But anyhow, that's stuff to read on that topic. We will talk more about that, or we'll answer that question more fully when we next get together for Stump the Stars. The reading I closed with and began with Isaiah chapter 56 deals with the other of the questions that was raised, which we did not get to, but we will get to next time around. It had to do with Shabbat and Sunday and the transfer from one to the other. You will recall that Isaiah 56 was very clear with regard to the future. There'll be a very special blessing for those who are not Jews who celebrate what? Sunday? Or what's often called the Lord's Day? No. Who will celebrate Shabbat. So, it appears that in the future, all kinds of people who are not Jews, as well as Jews, will celebrate Shabbat. So Shabbat remains important. But again, we'll answer that question. I just wanted, since it showed up in the Isaiah 56 chapter, I thought I'd at least reflect on that and begin to lay the foundation for answering that question related to Shabbat and Sunday.
Have we confused people enough for one night? Is that what you're saying?
I think we've confused people enough for one night, but at least wanted to recognize the fact that there were others who submitted questions, and we did there were parts of what we did tonight that sort of relate to that. But now you've got some homework for the rest of it. Okay.
Well, okay, then I'm just going to give my quick, if somebody says Sabbath was changed to Sunday, hand them a Bible. Find the verse.
Yes.
Find the verse
Yes, exactly.
where
Very good.
God changed the Sabbath to the first day of the week, Sunday. Good luck with that.
Okay. Now, related to what we've talked about, or any other questions that have come to your minds, we have a few minutes, not an awful lot of time, we have a few minutes that we can deal with those questions. So, first of all, those of you who are with us right here in the building.
Jessie is waving her hand.
I'm good.
Oh, you're
She's
good.
good.
Okay, she's waving her hand because, no, thank you. Okay.
Because we'll get to that one more fully
Yeah,
next
yeah.
time. Any of those of you who are with us whose faces we can see? I see
Oh, I see
Barbara.
two. I see two.
Okay, Barbara?
I find the whole concept of kosher really interesting, because every time I tell somebody I'm Messianic, that's the first question I get. It's like God knew what he said, and I finally got so aggravated having to try to answer it that I take them back to Genesis, where God said, don't eat the fruit from the tree. And what happened? Okay, so, don't need to be getting on me for eating kosher when I'm trying to do what God said.
Exactly. And what's interesting, by the way, this is sort of an aside, in another day, another age, in another place, I had an opportunity on a periodic basis to come in as a guest lecturer at a local junior college. I was brought in by an ex-Catholic priest. He was teaching a class called World Religions, and as part of that class, he wanted this class to be aware not only of Judaism, he brought in rabbis, but also of Messianic Judaism. And inevitably, the first question I was asked regarding my practice as a Messianic Jew was, do you observe the Sabbath? Do you keep Shabbat? Do you keep kosher? First two questions. So it relates to what you just said, Barbara.
Yeah, and frankly, Barbara, here's what I've taken to saying. Give me a definition of what you say kosher is to the person who's questioning you. You give me your definition of what you think kosher is, and let them start talking, and they won't get it right at all. They won't get it right. I've learned that certain people are just there to annoy us and to prove that we're wrong, even though they don't know us or they don't know what we know. And so I've learned to ask them a question to get them talking about where they're coming from, because I don't need to start talking about where I'm coming from. You need to tell me where you're coming from, the context you're coming from, to see if even your context is anywhere near the correct idea of what it is. That's just me. I'm getting more ornery as I get older.
Okay, that reminds me of a good similar kind of answer for the question when we get to it in a couple.
Snappy answers.
Snappy answers. Snappy answers to silly people.
To silly questions. So, have any of you read Mad Magazine or know about Mad Magazine? Mad Magazine used to have a feature every year, about every year, could be every couple times every year, where they would snappy answers to stupid questions. And the guy who wrote this was hilarious, funny. So an example would be, people are standing in an elevator with the door open, and somebody's walking down the hall and gonna get on the elevator, and the person who's walking in the hall looks at the elevator, and all around it, it says up, 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 arrows, up, 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 up. And the guy standing before he gets on the elevator says, does this car go up? So you have to have a snappy answer.
Yeah.
So then there was a whole list of snappy answers, but my favorite one, the top one was, no, we're going to go sideways now. That was my favorite one.
And rightly so.
Can't use it very often.
No.
But John and I are going to start having a book called Snappy Answers to, silly questions.
Okay, Virginia, you had a question.
In your response tonight, I heard of a list of passages mentioned that spoke about the future in a manner in which I wondered if those are passages that we could use to disprove this end of the world before Yeshua comes concept going on. That everything's going to be destroyed and you can't survive down here without, this Armageddon's going to happen. And many of them seem to be, how could that happen if so many of us are going to be following the Noahide laws, following Shabbat? I can't connect the two.
Yeah, there does seem to be sort of a disconnect.
There is a disconnect.
When you mentioned passages, I looked down at, I thought you were going to ask what were the references, so I looked down at the passages, and I saw a passage I forgot to share as part of our answer to this question. And this we reinforced in some sense in our weekly Shabbat services when we respond with V'zot HaTorah, acknowledging that these are the very words of God. In Exodus 19 and verse 8, when the people gathered at Sinai in acknowledgement of what God was delivering, said, all that the Lord has said we will do. Who were those people standing at Sinai? Were they all Jews? Or were they some Gentiles among them? Exodus text is clear. There were non-Jews who were part of the group that left Egypt during the Exodus, who would have been part of the group then standing at Sinai saying, all that the Lord has said we will do. Those non-Jews were making a very Jewish commitment at that time. So, as I intimated, this question and its answer goes back to the very beginning, so to speak, to Mount Sinai itself, when there were those who were Gentiles who also said, in effect, V'zot HaTorah, which is why it's perfectly appropriate then for those who are part of our synagogue as non-Jews, if they're living this kind of a Jewish lifestyle, to say the same thing, to respond with V'zot HaTorah. Okay, cool. I'm glad you raised that question because I would have forgotten all about Exodus 19:8. All right, then, next, Stump is not the second Saturday of April.
I have to get out my calendar.
Yes. Why not? They ask in
You'll
horror.
be very busy that evening.
Because
We can see into your future.
the day after the second Saturday of April is Resurrection Sunday, Hag Hadkiah.
Yeah, it's the day after Good Friday.
So, therefore, we will not pack the weekend over much by having Stump the Stars, but we will expect you to join us for Hag Hadkiah, the Festival of the Resurrection, that following Sunday morning. And just so you're aware, morning, for us in this particular community, this is not a sunrise service. For us, the sunrise is promptly at 11 o'clock in the morning.
Unless you want to stay up all night
Yeah, well, that's fine.
and see the sunrise in the morning, that'd be fine with me.
So our service will be, as per normal, at 11 o'clock in the morning that Sunday. So what is the date then of the next Stump?
Well, we're not meeting on April Fool's Day, which is actually...
No, but that's,
That's April 1st.
yeah, we will meet the 2nd and 4th.
I know that.
Yeah.
I was just saying
Oh, right, yes.
that we could have met on April
We could,
Fool's Day.
no, we didn't, no, that would not be a good idea.
The 22nd. Well, we have 5 Saturdays in April.
So we
The
meet
1st, the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd, and 29th.
So we'll meet the 22nd.
Earth Day.
Do we not have another one this month? What about March 25th?
Oh, I didn't even think about that.
I was just listening to what you said. I was not checking myself. I'm marking it down. Thank you,
Completely
Barbara.
over my head. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you,
Yes,
Barbara. You
we
are
do have
correct.
another one in March. So that's not sorry, forgive me. The next one is not April 22nd.
But I think I'm glad that we reminded them of all the stuff that's happening in April.
Yes. So then, yes, we will meet on March 25th. Thank you, Barbara.
Yeah.
Boy, someone's got to keep us on track
I
here.
know. We can't keep it together. Well, yesterday, some of you don't know, we were surprised, literally, when who walks through the door before the services last night? Then someone who was in our wedding that we haven't seen for over 40 years. So ever since then, personally,
We're sort
I've
of-
been all discombobulating. I just been,
Out of step.
I have no idea. And luckily, he saw him first. And so he didn't faint dead away when he was up on the bema, and he looked out in the synagogue and go, who are those people? Oh my gosh! Thank goodness. Correct?
Yes, so there's a reason for our
We're very confused.
disorientation. But again, thank you, Barbara, for putting us back on the right track. All right, with that being said, Patricia, would you be kind enough to close for us?
Oh, sure. Let me get my purse together. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father and our King, you are a great God, and it is a privilege to serve you. We thank you and praise you for all you do in our everyday lives. We thank you also that we can read and learn about what's happened in the past, that we can draw encouragement from those who've lived a life of faith throughout our past, that we can learn from the mistakes others made. And hopefully, Father, that you would keep instructing us and teaching us how you would like us to behave and what rules you absolutely think we should follow. Let us be careful and let us be open to your leading in all aspects of our lives. We want to thank you and praise you too for taking care of our loved ones, our families, those we're close to. We know we don't deserve your goodness to us and those close to us, but we thank you and praise you for that. B'Shem Yeshua Meshachenu, in the name of Yeshua our Messiah. Amen.
Thank you all for joining us, for your patience, for your involvement, and now we say